All right, so tonight is another letter entitled James. Now, James is in the very first verse. It's listed, but it doesn't really give a classification of which James it's talking about. It just says James. And back at that time, James was actually an extremely common name, like very common name. And so the reality is we do not have 100% evidence of who it is. I'll say right off the bat, most theologians believe it's the third choice. It's the half-brother of Jesus, his oldest half-brother, son of Mary and Joseph. That's who they believe it to be, but there's no scriptural evidence for that, and nobody fully collaborates that that's who it is. I mean, it technically could be a James that's not even mentioned in any other scriptures. So two of the other ones that are highly debated is, the son of Zebedee and brother of John. Those are mentioned in the scriptures. And also the son of Alphaeus. Now, the second one, the son of Alphaeus, is really not mentioned very much in Scripture. And surprisingly, I'm rereading this. I didn't clarify this very well. This comment, there are some that believe the son of Alphaeus is the half-brother of Jesus. The way this is written, I'm not very clear. I said no solid evidence. I put this in there because I believe that there is evidence it can't be him. I'm surprised people think this. That's actually why I put this in here. Right in Acts 1:13 and how it's written and the reference to, we know that James was not saved during Jesus' ministry, then how could he be one of the early apostles, or disciples? So just that alone, I don't know. Most people think it was around 45 AD, but it's really a 20-year range, 40 to 60 AD. Now again, because most people think it was James, the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote it, he was killed in 62 AD. So that's the reason for 60 as being possibly the latest date. And then 40, of course, was very early after the crucifixion of Jesus. And so for the people that believe this date, they believe this to be one of the oldest or possibly the first of the epistles that were written, and of course that we have, that were maintained for us. And here are some of the reasons for why some people believe this to be one of the earliest written. When you go through the epistles, you can see a progression of some of the concepts and building upon previous letters. The concepts and the sound doctrine, and especially the Gnosticism that they were dealing with, and the Judaism trying to get back in there. You can see that progression in the epistles. And in this one, it doesn't have any of that. So for that reason, it's assumed that this came about before that was really a major issue being dealt with. And the other thing, for the reason of the date being around 45, is the Jerusalem Council was around 50 AD. And if this was James, the half-brother of Jesus, he is mentioned in there in Acts chapter 15. And in fact, he had some sort of authority because halfway through there, he speaks up and he says, "Brethren, listen to me." Well, by the context of that, he clearly had a position of authority at that meeting. We don't know what it was, and he wasn't the only one, but clearly he was in a leadership role at that time. And it's pretty, a lot of important items were discussed there. Again, more of the mixture of the Old Testament and New Testament concepts at that council, again, based on that context, that would have been in this writing if that had occurred yet. So again, that's a long way of saying it's believed that this was written before the Jerusalem Council happened. And as I already mentioned, the Jew versus Greek, that controversy, that's not mentioned in here at all either. And as we know from the Paul epistles, it's just littered throughout all of that concept. The audience in particular is Messianic Jews. To take a step back from that, it's really the Christian church in general, but the original audience was Messianic Jews. And I'm actually going to skip forward to the second bullet there real quick. This is considered the first of the 7 general epistles. These are all the ones at the end of the New Testament in the order that we have now. You start with James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation is its own. So those first 7 epistles, and they're considered general because they are not specifically written to a individual or a specific local church as the rest are. Now, of course, the other ones, a lot of them, they were meant to be circular, so it went to one church and then it went to another church. This letter's like that too. It was meant to be sent around to all of the churches, but it's not mentioned in the text specifically what area it was written to. And so that's why it's referred to as a general epistle. It's really meant for the Christian body as a whole. So getting back at least to the original audience, the first point there, it mentions it right away in the very first verse that this is to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. So it's, of course, referring to the 12 tribes of Israel and the fact that they're still in the diaspora kind of period where they're scattered. They're not really convened all in the same location. And there's also in chapter 2, verse 2, there's a reference to a synagogue instead of a church. So again, it's pointing out that it's talking to a Hebrew audience. And mentions later in verse 21 of chapter 2 that Abraham, our father, and again, James was Jewish, obviously. And the other element that was in here there are a lot of Old Testament illustrations. So again, dealing on things that the readers would have very easily understood, concepts they all knew. The 2 main purposes of this particular letter are really ethics and faith. Ethics from the concept to stress that Christians must, and I should have underlined that, must have good works. And faith, provide encouragement for your faith in the times of suffering and persecution. Persecution that will come, not if it'll come, when it comes. So some characteristics of this particular one. The 2 words I already mentioned in the purpose, faith and works, those are the key words, the key concept in this particular letter. And a key feature that I had actually forgotten about this until I was reading up on this, it actually has a strong likeness to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. There's a lot of similarities with what Jesus covered there also in this writing. And that's one I had forgotten. So that part I think is kind of cool. In comparison with its length, this particular epistle, it's not a super long one, but in that context, it's loaded with illustrations to clarify points. It's part of normal preaching. You provide some doctrine, and then you provide some sort of illustration or application to make it more understandable to the audience or listeners. And so that is used throughout this whole letter. And just from a doctrinal point of view, this is considered the least doctrinal book or epistle in the entire New Testament. Again, the stuff in here is still super important, but from core doctrine, none of those strong statements are in this particular epistle. Rather, this one really focuses on, just like the illustrations, practical application, practical aspects of life. How do you apply this gospel of Jesus to your life? It's coming from that context. And in fact, the very teaching style in here, the grammar, it's written in a style that the Jews would have been familiar with. So it's more of a rabbinical style from Judaism. The way they would lay things out, it would refer to things, again, that they know about and build upon that. And then the illustrations would, sink the point home. Just one other loose comment. At the very end, there's some brief end times comments that are given in the context of patience, which again ties back to your faith. Have patience. And this is one that I more added myself. I've heard people talk around this concept, but this particular letter really, to me, this actually reads like a pastor who is speaking to his flock. He's trying to provide encouragement. These are people that he knows. He's not necessarily going into a lot of correction, but he knows what the issues they're dealing with. He knows where they're coming from, and what's throughout this is a strong push of exhortation, trying to encourage his flock to not lose the faith, to be strong in your faith, and then what else? To encourage them to action. Don't just sit on your faith. And so, he was concerned with their spiritual well-being, the things that were going on in their life. And again, it wasn't on a personal level, it was on a group level, the way the message is given in this letter. And again, right back to this illustration concept, it provides multiple examples of how to practically walk out your faith in Jesus Christ. A brief historical context of this, James the person, again, if this is who the author is, who most think it is, he was the oldest half-brother of Jesus, and we believe him to be the oldest because from the Greek writing, as I mentioned before, usually the man is listed before the woman. Well, age was also listed in order. So if you ever list people in that context, like children or genealogy, the age would be in order, and his name is listed first in the two scriptural references that we have. He was assumed to be married because of what is said in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, where it says, "Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas?" So from that, it was assumed that he was married. He was around Jesus all of his life based on the context. He grew up with them, and there's no mention of him growing up somewhere else. What's that? Bethsaida. So he was in the Bethsaida area. That part I didn't know. But he would have known Jesus as Jesus grew up. He wasn't a stranger to him. He did not believe in Jesus as the Christ during his 3-year ministry, and that is said very plainly in John chapter 7, verse 5. And we do know from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 7, that the risen Jesus appeared directly to him, where it said, "Then he appeared to James and then to all the apostles." So he did see his risen half-brother after he was crucified. In Acts chapter 1, verse 14, it records that he was present in that well-known upper room where they were praying. He was there. It mentions him by name. And as I mentioned before, he was in some sort of church leadership role. Based on the early writings, he was a pastor for many years. The word pastor is not listed in the scriptures to say that that's what he did, but by the early writings of the church fathers, multiple said that he was a pastor, specifically of Antioch, the Syrian Antioch. There's two, Pisidian Antioch, Syrian Antioch. The one in Syria, that was the first Greek Gentile church, and James was the pastor of it. So that's where he did most of his ministry. As I already mentioned, he did preside over the Jerusalem council. He spoke as having authority in the scriptures in Acts chapter 15, verse 13. And so his serving at the Christian church, there's some references to that in Acts and Galatians. As I mentioned earlier, Josephus, a Jewish historian, actually recorded that James was stoned in 62 AD by the religious leaders of that time. I don't remember the reason why. Clearly, it had to do with the fact that he was preaching Jesus and not the Orthodox Judaism. One thing that I did know, and I actually forgot where I heard about it, but the source that I was using said that it's in Hegesippus, around 180 AD, another one of the early church writers. He actually referred to James as old camel knees. I had heard this before. James was a man of prayer. Massive, massive, massive man of prayer. Was on his knees all the time. Again, I don't have the sources here, but I'm positive there's more than one source that refers to this concept. He was on his knees a lot in prayer. Very strong prayer warrior. So that's the mindset of the person that we're talking about here as the author of this letter. Key verse I've got down is James chapter 2, verse 26. As usual, when you look at multiple sources, not everybody agrees on the same one. I chose this one because I think it does really sum up, again, the theme of this particular epistle. And that is, "For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also." Moving into chapter 1, this chapter, in this particular case, the way we added the chapters, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, they really do end after certain points have been made. So all of these sections will cover one chapter each. Excuse me. I titled this particular one, "The Testing of Faith." It's going to happen. That's the concept that James is getting across here. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience, but let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. This is a tough one for a lot of people. Count it all joy when things stink. It's basically what it's saying. But the reason I included those following verses, so I bold-faced the first part, right? Count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. That's bold-faced for a reason, because pretty much all Christians have heard that one. But a lot of people stop right there in the memorization, and they don't grab the next two verses that say the why that's important. Knowing this, here's the reason. The trying of your faith worketh patience. There's a point to this. It helps you grow. It helps you mature. So to pull back slightly from that, this joy in trials is actually an Old Testament concept. So it wasn't created in the New Testament. It was reused here in the New Testament. But this concept of trials, working on your patience was a well-known concept in Judaism. So this was kind of it was a rabbinical type of teaching. And as I already mentioned, these trials would build and perfect a person's character. And the reason to go back to the boldface, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, I underlined those three words intentionally. The first word is when. It's not if, when it happens. These temptations will happen. It is inevitable. It is guaranteed when they happen. And then the next word I underline, when ye fall. What does fall mean? If you fall, it's an accident. It's oops. It's you stepped here and you fell over. It means it's unexpected. You're not going to see them coming. So when you fall into temptation, it's going to just out of the blue, boom. And it's a when. It's inevitable. It's something out of the blue will happen that tempts you. And then, of course, diverse temptation. The gamut. It's not going to be one particular kind. It's going to be all kinds of temptations. That's what it's trying to get across here. This concept of it's not just going to be one. It's not just going to be two. It's not just going to be here and there. This is going to be a constant temptation, quite frankly, in this life. So when, fall, diverse. Three concepts just in that short little bit of words. The frequency of temptations. So, we've talked about why we should count it joy. So, how do we manage these temptations? That's what Paul gets to in the latter half of chapter 1. In verse 2, he starts right out, of course, I've already said it like 3 times, adopt an attitude of joy. Yeah, it stinks when things are going bad, but, it's like the refining fire. The chaff is burned off and the good stuff is left over. Verses 5 through 8. Ask for wisdom from God. That is, again, this is James's suggestion. This is the God of the universe. He has wisdom if you'll just ask. And this is where he begins to, right in chapter 1, start stressing, do not waver in your faith. In the King James, that word specifically in there, do not waver in your faith. James chapter 1, verse 8, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And this ties in with that word waver. Don't waver in your faith. Don't go back and forth in what you think. Don't what if it. Be firm and solid in what you know of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Verses 9 through 11. Adjust your perspective. Look at the big picture. Again, this is about Jesus. This is about focusing on the spiritual reality of life. And I kind of jumped the gun there. Look forward to the future promise. James chapter 1, verse 12. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. It's a promise of a future reward for enduring this temptation. And the temptation is only for a time. Yeah, we can live up to 100 years, but what's 100 years when, they're saying it's already been 5,700 years since Adam was created? It's a long time. And as we know, the famous song, when we've been here 10,000 years, we'll have no less days to sing his praise. It's a long time. 100 years really is short in the big picture. Temptation is then explained in verses 13 through 18. Step 1. In James chapter 1, 13 and 14. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So that's the stage 1 of temptation. So before I move on to step 2, this is a rhetorical question since I know everybody in here probably knows the answer. Have you sinned at this point? You're drawn away of your lust and you're enticed. Have you sinned at this point? No. You haven't sinned yet. You've been enticed. Because Jesus was tempted, and it wasn't a sin to be tempted. It's what you do with the temptation. Step 2, chapter 15a. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And that's the evidence for what I just said. That's the point at which sin comes forth. That lust, you act on it. It grows in your heart. The temptation is there. The enticement is there. And your heart receives it, works on it. That's when the sin happens. And then step 3, as we know from Romans 3:23 and 6:23, and sin, when it is finished, bring forth death. That's the result of sin. So, the solution to avoid steps 2 and 3, as it says in verses 17 and 18, is to focus on the good gifts from God. That's your focus. That needs to be your context. That needs to be what you think about, pray about, meditate about. When life is, whatever this temptation is, it is nothing compared to Jesus. It really isn't. And that can be proven how it really isn't. James chapter 1, verse 22. I love this one. This is one a lot of people know as well. Tons of people memorize it. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. This is essentially the summation of chapter 1, verses 19 through 27. This is the teaching point that James is trying to get across. And so with this statement, he's encouraging action in his readers. Don't just hear this good word. Be active. Have good works. So he gives practical examples, such as watch your tongue, visit widows and orphans, be slow to speak and slow to wrath. Again, practical examples. These are how you can be active in your faith. Moving into chapter 2, again, this is another subsection that James is talking about, and this is the working of your faith. This is that key purpose phrase, works. Works are so important. James chapter 2, verse 1. My brethren, have not the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with respect of persons. This was an illustration. He opens up this particular chapter with this illustration of pandering to rich people or people who appear better, and to people who are poor or appear less, treating them less. His whole stress with this illustration is to not be partial to people based on whatever, fill in the blank, but to be impartial to each and every human being. That's what's being stressed here in these first 9 verses. Moving down to James chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. Even so, faith, if it have not works, is dead, being alone. Yea, a man may say, thou hast faith, and I have works. Show me thy faith without thy works, and I will show thee my faith by my works. And that is really the stress here. I will show thee my faith by my works. These good works are a fruit of saving faith. And I'm going to expound more on this, but James is frequently used because James is trying to stress works as an outward expression, as a fruit of a saving faith. That is really what he's trying to get across here. Don't just, be active. It should pour out of your heart. If you have a saving faith, you are going to have a burden to do these things because Jesus has a burden for these things. You can't help it. You have a burden for good works. And I've heard many teachings that try and use James out of context to say it's all about works, and it's actually tied to your salvation. Completely true, completely false, and that can be proved with like 46 scriptures. That is not what he's saying here. He is focusing on the fruit. That's what the works are. They are a fruit of a saving faith. So, chapter 2, verses 14 through 26 is full of illustrations, more illustrations, getting this part of works across. And it shows how this saving faith must have fruit of good works. It has to be there. You know, if you don't have this fruit, do you really have a saving faith? Do you really have a burden for the lost? Moving down to James chapter 2, that should be 19 to 22, I guess. No, 21 to 22. I just missed the chapter 2 part. Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Seest thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect? Again, another one taken out of context. What does it say? Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works? Just take that out right there. Boom. Here's proof. You're justified. You're saved by works. That is the wrong way to teach the Bible. That's the wrong way to preach the Bible. You always have to use context. And I have heard people take just that phrase. Was not Abraham justified by works? That's trying to get the Bible to say what you want it to, not what it's trying to say. And that's why I included what I have here. Verse 22. Seest thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect? The point is on the faith. When you read the text here, the point is not the works. The point is, it's the faith that was made perfect by the works. The faith was already there, and the faith is the salvation part. And again, with the way it's written, it can sound confusing at first if you don't really study the context of what James is trying to get across here. So, this is really an illustration of the circular effect that faith has with works. We know by Ephesians, it's crystal clear, it is by grace you are saved through faith. There is no question, not of works, lest any man boast. It is crystal clear, it is by faith. So you start with faith, the circle starts. Now you've got works, which strengthens your faith. Now you've got works, which strengthens the faith, and it just keeps going in a circle. It just keeps reinforcing both. And that is the illustration that James is trying to get across here. How it just keeps, it's like you spin a top, and now it doesn't slow down, it actually spins faster, because it's reinforcing both concepts, but it starts with faith. And so, just like the spinning top I mentioned, that's faith that's alive. That's faith in action. That's faith that's doing something. It's not dead. If there's no works, where does the top keep spinning? It slows down. That faith isn't being reinforced. And, like it's up above, even so faith, if it have not works, is dead, being alone. Again, the pairing that James is trying to get across here, it's alone. Faith can't do it by alone. It needs to be reinforced by works that come out of your faith. That's the illustration. And so the first illustration we had for this concept was about Abraham. Again, Old Testament, they all know it. He ends with the exact same illustration with Rahab. Rahab the harlot, as it says in there. And she also, the word justified is in there as well. Same example as provided with Abraham. So an application of this particular chapter, no one else can peer into your heart and see your saving faith. You know your heart. You know if you've got your relationship with Jesus, but you can't look at them, and unless the Holy Spirit tells you something, and really that's a place you don't want to go to, you can't look at person A, person B, and say that person's saved. But what can you see? You can see their fruit. And we're supposed to work as a body, right? We're supposed to exert and encourage one another. What effect does that have if 90% of the church is doing nothing? Nobody's motivated. What's the effect if 90% of the church is on fire? It'll be 100% pretty soon. That's the effect it'll have. That 10% will be on fire. That's the effect it'll have. So that's the stress, again, of this chapter. They see your faith by your works. So while they see your works, that's confirming your faith. Same thing as the example. It's not your faith is the salvation, not the work. So it's just, I think it's a really good example of the tying together of the two concepts. Moving into James chapter 3, the wisdom of faith. There is a heavy focus on this chapter, specifically on guard your tongue. Watch your tongue, watch what you say. Your words have power. Chapter 3, verse 1, it specifically cautions excessive teachers. And by excessive, that's not very clear. Apparently, there was a lot of people that wanted to be teachers. So like he was saying, don't all you guys want to go running out being teachers now? And he stresses, like, don't you realize teachers are judged more harshly? You need to be sure you're called to be a teacher. Don't just go running out trying to tell everybody else what to do. So that's the stress right away in chapter 1. Use wisdom when you speak. It is the key to self-control and maturity in Christ. It's really self-discipline. And keep your hearts pure. Why? Well, obviously there's a ton of reasons to that, but in the text, chapter 3, verse 16 specifically says, for where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. So right before that, it's saying keep this envy and strife out of your heart. What does it say in 16? Where envy and strife are, if it's in your heart, there is confusion and every evil work. So guard your tongue, guard what comes out, guard what goes in. James chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good works, without partiality. That concept again, without partiality, and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. That's a summation for that particular chapter. Moving into chapter 4, the nature of faith. And I actually put this in parentheses. We're talking about whose nature? Well, God is our originator, right? What is his nature? Godliness. So this nature of the faith that's working in us, it's godliness in all things. This concept of sanctification, perfection, moving towards being more like Jesus, that's the nature of faith. That's what it does in you. That's the work that it does in you. James chapter 4, verses 7 through 8. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. This is actually 8, the first part of verse 8. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. I frequently hear verse 7 only. And for me personally, I really think that the first part of verse 8 also has to be there because I feel they go together. You can't just do one without the other. Because this whole resist the devil and he will flee from you, that's you. That's your own power we're talking about. Well, Satan is an archangel, right? Draw nigh unto God and he will draw nigh unto you. God, to God, Satan's nothing. So yes, resist the devil. How? By drawing nigh unto God. To me, that's the focus. Because so often I hear people saying, I'm trying to resist the devil, I'm trying, and I'm being dramatic on purpose because I'm doing it. Verse 8, no, draw nigh to God. Let him do it. Let him do it. And that's why everybody who repeats this verse, I'll usually finish it for them if they don't say it. Draw nigh unto God. That's the key, that's the focus of the target here. So this is a very practical example. Stuff happens. What do I do? Draw nigh to God. Draw nigh to God. Think on God. Pray to God. That's the focus. Again, the focus is not on Satan. Don't give him the airtime. Focus on God. James chapter 4, verse 15. For that ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. I specifically pointed out this one because this is a wonderful practical example of how to approach daily life. We all plan, right? I'm planning that I'm going to do this. If we're going to plan to go on a vacation, we're going to plan to do this. Well, according to this, we ought to say, if the Lord will, I will do something. Always be open to the surprise that the Lord has for you. You don't know what it is. In the middle of your vacation, you could end up in a hospital praying for somebody. You don't know. So always be, Lord willing, these are my plans, but if the Lord will, I will do this. I love this practical example. James chapter 4, verse 17. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and do it not, to him it is sin. This is a very key scripture. So somebody says, I'm not going to get involved, right? Well, if you've been convicted and seen something that should be done, something that's good, whether it be a concept that you know to be good or a situation where you're getting an unction from the Holy Spirit to do something and you do it not, that's a sin. It's about obedience. Obedience to our Father, ready in season and out of season. That's the stressor here. So essentially, to put it in different terms, you're sold out to Jesus, right? He trumps your plans. He trumps, what you know. So if you're made aware of something, you do have to act on it. There's now accountability once you know. Moving into James chapter 5, this is the last chapter of the letter. James 5, verse 8, be ye also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. This is really a summation of the whole letter. This is our future hope. This is what we are all looking for when Jesus returns in the sky. This is the end goal, and we have to be patient for it. More in chapter 5 is yet more practical teaching. I'm just going to list a few of them. In verse 10, it mentions patience amongst affliction. And it even says, count them happy which endure this affliction, because they're enduring it for Christ, for his glory, not their own. Verse 13, it's actually asks the question, is anyone afflicted? Well, then pray. Is anyone merry? Sing psalms. Is anyone sick? I love this one. It's so practical. James chapter 5, verses 14 through 16. Is any sick among you? Well, here's an answer to that as a practical example. Let him call for the elders of the church, and let they pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And if the prayer of faith shall save the sick, and the Lord shall raise him up, and if he have committed sins, they shall be forgiven him. Confess your faults one to another, and pray for one another that ye may be healed. And I boldface this part, because again, this is really the point of this practical application. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Prayer is so important, it's not to be overlooked. And then it ends with an illustration of Elijah, first praying for the rain to stop, which it does, and they go into a drought. And then later it says he prayed again, and it started raining again. And I just thought of one example that I'm actually going to take a little rabbit trail on here briefly. So the reason I stress this was a example. Again, this isn't about legalism. If somebody's sick, it doesn't mean you have to do this 100% of the time, what's in here. This is listed as, this is something you can do. This is an example of what you can do. And, the Lord works in mysterious ways. I know a testimony of some ladies, I think it was 3 or 4 of them. They were praying over somebody who was really sick, and it was a terminal, it was probably cancer or something, but it was something terminal. I don't remember the disease. But they were doing what their Bible said. And it says, okay, we're going to pray over him. Check. Anoint him with oil in the name of Lord. Well, they read it, and they're like, it doesn't say how much. So they got a gallon of oil, just put the whole thing on the person. And now that sounds funny, right? The person was completely healed. I love stories like that. And again, their faith was pure. They were simply trying to pray, righteously unto God. It wasn't about ceremony. It wasn't about bragging or showy. They were pure in heart and pure in intent. And that's why I love that example. Yes, they gave all. They got it. They bought a gallon of oil. They didn't know how much. It was a great story. Oh, I love that. But yeah, I mean, that's not one I heard like, hurt a person, hurt a person, hurt a person. No, it was one of those where I talked to somebody who was friends with the person, and the person who was prayed over went to the doctor, and it was confirmed. Complete remission, complete healing, whatever it was. I assume it was cancer. I just can't remember. But I love testimonies like that. Jesus still heals today. By his stripes we are healed. So sort of the application that I was going to use for this one is, again, this concept that I had forgotten, the likeness of this epistle to what Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount. And so I listed these here if you want to look at them later. I read through them, and I thought that the parallels were really cool. So just to summarize these really quickly, essentially confession is not enough to get you into heaven. Those two sets of verses there. Hearing and doing go together. Don't just be hearers of the word, be doers of the word. This is covered by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. The next section, a person's character is known by his actions. Again, this concept, this is the fruit. This is the fruit of your faith. And then another section, warnings against judging others. That's both here and on the Sermon on the Mount. And it's also mentioned the wrong use of wealth. A lot of people will try and teach that any wealth at all is bad. Only wealth that's used wrong. That's what's bad. Always remember the example, Solomon, because he didn't ask for riches and because he asked for wisdom, God gave him wealth. So just being wealthy alone isn't a sin. It's what you do with it. And then wrong use of swearing, that's also in both places. When you do that concept. So anyway, I thought that part was interesting. You can choose to review those or not. It's up to you. But I thought that was cool to see. Again, the examples that are repeated, because of course Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, that's solid red text. So I thought it was cool to see the concepts reiterated in James by his brother, who didn't believe while he was alive. First life, I should say.